Welcome back to the Darkest Theory podcast. I'm ScrapBrain here with my co-host Subtle. What's
What's
going
going
on,
on?
Subtle?
What's going on, everyone?
Hey. So before we get into our topic for today, I wanted to give a quick shout out to our friend Bread Bun. They made the fantastic icon that you see on our profile that led into this video. So you can find them at breadbun underscore underscore. So thank you so much for the icon. It looks fantastic. We're very happy with it.
Definitely, yeah. Much appreciated for sure.
Yeah. So the topic for this week is one that really, really makes me upset a lot. Anybody who knows me knows that this is something that really bothers me about the Dead by Daylight community, and that is the idea of what winning is in the game, if it even exists in the first place. So, everybody has their own definitions for what winning is in this game because there's no really clearly defined win condition. But we're gonna go over some of the like common methods that people consider to be a win in Dead by Daylight, and then we're gonna kind of have a freeform discussion over what we kind of define as wins for the game and how they may align with or differ from the community's views. So, um, Subtle, do you want to go into how some of the victory conditions are considered within the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that jumps out first, right, is anything associated with killer win streaks, in particular, right? Like a lot of content creators will go for various win streaks, particularly on specific killers, trying to get X amount in a row on public matches. Sometimes they'll kind of rotate, trying to do one of each killer character in a row to try to go throughout the entire cast. And generally, the parameters are no one escapes through the exit gates. So generally, it's considered a 3 or 4K, with disconnects kind of being considered as a kill most of the time. And with the RNG associated with hatch and the possibility pretty often of people being able to just disconnect to try to give their teammate an opportunity at hatch, those situations are kind of left as an outlier, and that match is still considered as a win. Then obviously you have stuff in the competitive community, which gets a little bit more complex, and it depends a lot on the given tournament and what the tournament organizers want to define as a win. Usually there's point systems involved, depending on hooking different survivors for the first time, confirming a kill, and how many generators were left. It really depends and can get a lot more complicated. But at least for public matches, I would say the most common one that you encounter is 3 or 4K with no one escaping through the exit gate. So that's probably the most common one, I would say.
Yeah, and I agree that that is the most common way that most people will refer to wins, but you get people who will define it as 3 wins whether somebody escapes through the exit gate or not. Some people will consider, um, you know, 0 or 1 kills a loss and 2 kills a tie, or there's all of these amorphous different ways that people try and qualify a win or sometimes quantify a win in their head, but there's nothing clear about what winning a game of Dead by Daylight is. The official behavior competitive like tournament series, it is based entirely off of kills versus escapes. Um, but I mean, for each individual person, you know, Otstarva, for example, is very well known for doing his killer win streaks, like you were alluding to. And he's changed his definitions for what a win is over the course of him doing all of these. At the very start, it was um, 3 or 4 kills where one of them could escape through the exit gate, and then he eliminated that, and then like 2 kills was a tie, so it didn't lose the streak, but it didn't progress it any. And even people who kind of built their brand off of these win streaks or these competitive tournaments, or this Dead by Daylight tournament series put on by Behavior, everything's just very fluid and amorphous and not very well defined. And in our, you know, public games that we play against, we get killers all the time. And, you know, I get, and I'm sure you get, and I'm sure everybody who plays killer gets in theirs, survivors talking about who won or lost the match. And it's just a very frustrating thing to me because there's no clear victory condition and people put so much importance on it when it's not well defined.
Yeah, and I think like even beyond what you define statistically, right? Like it doesn't even account for all of the other variables that go into a game, an individual match and how it's balanced, right? Like the builds, the map, the way that like not even just what map you go to, but how strong the map setup is because as we all know,
Right. The tile layouts
each
and
individual
yeah.
tile layout and the safety and how everything is like kind of strung together, it's like it's very possible to have one like a map you load into one time have a bunch of really strong tiles connected that the killer can't really do much about versus another time that doesn't exist and there's a lot of dead zones and they get a really strong 3 gen setup and they just end up holding that forever and it's kind of just a situation where the survivors can't get past that to be able to power all of the generators. And that's also not accounting for items, right? Like med kits with really strong syringe and styptic add-ons or really strong toolboxes with brand new parts. Not to mention that like the wide range of killers, right? You have some of the really low tier ones that jump off, trapper, clown, stuff in that vein, versus blight, spirit, and nurse at the top. Not to mention the add-ons that like further there's a lot of ways that you can influence your chance of achieving whatever win condition that you set, and that doesn't even usually get accounted for. People kind of just say, hey, whatever you brought into the match, like that's on you. You could have brought better, you could have done a different build. But as we'll kind of get to, not everyone is concerned about that as much and wants to play for a different reason. So if you want to kind of take over.
Yeah, so I would like to talk about what each of us consider win conditions in the game. And this is probably going to sound a bit like an echo chamber because the two of us play together so often. We generally have a pretty similar outlook to the game. And it's like that can be a cause and effect thing. I think that we play together so much because we have a similar outlook to the game as opposed to we have a similar outlook to the game because we play so much, you know?
Right.
But I think that going over what we consider to be a win, uh, and then like having that free flowing discussion is where I want to go next. So, for me, I could die 18,000 games in a row and still consider all of them to be wins. I personally do not consider a game of Dead by Daylight won or lost, whether I survived or not, as a survivor. As a killer, I can get 0 Ks for 18,000 games in a row, and I can still consider them wins, potentially. For me, it is if I played to a level that I'm happy with, and if I thought that the match was fun and enjoyable. A great example of this is Subtle and myself, along with a couple of our friends, will every now and then just have nights where we'll run completely meme builds. Stuff like for the people to pick up our teammates and Soul Guard to take hits when we pick them up and Medal of Man to tank the protection. It's and just all of this stuff. And we never touch generators. That's the whole point. We never touch generators. We just run around. We have a lot of fun together. And the vast majority of our killers really appreciate that we're not gen rushing and playing super sweaty and just trying to be optimal. And it's a nice change of pace for a lot of the killers that we go against. And there are some that have reacted poorly to it and think that we're bully squads. But in general, it seems like most of those kind of games, even if we don't escape, I would still consider those wins because everybody's having a good time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it really differs, right? Like when I'm playing as killer, I feel like a lot more in control of like how I'm kind of dictating how the match is being played, right? Like, so I can choose whether or not to tunnel or to camp once I get like the first couple of downs. Like, I can kind of decide, and so like when I'm playing the match, I'm not intentionally trying to tunnel or camp. I'm usually just trying to find survivors as quick as possible. As someone who's plays Huntress a good amount, but as well as other killers, just trying to get a lot of downs as quickly as possible and force survivors off of gens that way. And also, I kind of like, there isn't really a defined win condition a lot of the time for me because it changes so much, especially with the amount of play. Huntress's maps play such a heavy role in how she fares on a lot of maps. So, like, in a lot of matches. So, Grim Pantry and Fractured Cowshed are like two of the maps that like kind of jump out to me as really, really tough maps to perform well on compared to others without like really diving into trying to 3 gen, throwing on a bunch of slowdown, which I don't do. And obviously I'm not bringing map offerings, and you can't always control what map. So I usually opt not to, but like getting 5, 6, 7 hooks, regardless of the kill counter, like you can see the hook counter at the end. That's pretty good in my estimation. Anything above that is like a really strong performance, but that's like pretty typical, even if I'm playing relatively mediocre. And it also is one of those things that you can't play your absolute best every time. The game has got a lot of RNG, obviously we were talking about, but also depending on the killer that you're playing, there's an execution barrier I think that exists as well. And not to mention that like you're playing such a small sample size of mind games against the survivors that you go against. If you're killer or a survivor, you only get so many chase opportunities against the killer, so it's very easy for a chase to go badly. But if you were to play that out a bunch of times against the same two players going head to head, a lot of those situations are just coin flips a good amount of the time and could easily go differently. It's kind of just average matches. But I would say most of the time, if I'm as killer, 5, 6, 7, 8 hooks in that range is really good, regardless of the kill counter. If it results in more hooks than that, more kills, like awesome. And obviously I'm kind of evaluating my mind how I felt about the match. And like you said, like it's more about my own performance when I'm playing killer, and obviously a big part of that is not having a team. But when I'm survivor, I definitely feel like I'm more team oriented. Like you said, it's like if I'm dying in a match or X number of matches in a row, there's not always situations that you can control, right? Like if you get a Bubba, right, you go against Leatherface, you get chased for 5 gens, and then he camps you when he catches you at the end because you've used a lot of resources, and odds are eventually you're going to get downed. If gens take X amount of time, eventually they're going to catch up. They're just faster and have a killer power, but they can prevent you from being unhooked. So if you don't escape, that means you lost, even though you basically controlled the whole match. Like that logic doesn't pan out. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. Feel like that's probably the case for a lot of people. Don't really see that as a loss. So as survivor, I really account more for how the team felt and how like the general match went, how I felt like I played in chases and made the most of the resources, and also again like contextualizing the strength of the killer power and add-ons and stuff, and the kind of the hand that you were dealt in the match. So yeah, definitely it's it's hard to quantify just by like a single number without getting context of what the match actually was and featured.
Yeah, like if I so like as a killer player, if there's just there's such a huge range to kind of conceptualize in terms of this. So like as a killer, imagine you go up against a like full comp squad and you two hook everybody. So you get 8 hooks total, but you get no kills. And they have full loadouts and they're comp players. Versus if you go against a bunch of survivors that are solo queuing and they each have like 100 hours, and you tunnel somebody off hook and camp them and you get a kill, but like that's better in some regards. Like that just doesn't make sense to me. It's it's unquestionably a weaker performance, it's less fun for everybody. It just doesn't make sense to me. Um, the uh, brain totally farted there. Take over.
Oh, good. No, I was just gonna say, like, you were kind of talking a little bit earlier about how the kill streaks have and like the what defines a win has kind of shifted and evolved and stuff over months and years. And as someone who's played like for a while, the strength and the ability of a killer to have a real chance in a match, regardless of what loadouts the survivors have, has drastically changed. I mean, you have really old brand new parts that were basically just finishing a gen within 10-15 seconds, versus now where it's a quarter of a gen. You had way stronger maps with entity blocker used to not exist. There used to be a way more like a way higher number of pallets and resources, and killers at one point weren't even allowed to kick gens. Like they're like that point existed as well, which is just a crazy thing to think about. But like, you used to not be able to regress a generator. Like that was,
Yeah, I didn't even know about that.
yeah, which is like a crazy thing. But it used to be, right, when I think once the game was kind of developed long enough, once barbecue and chili was like the way that you get double blood points and stuff, and it was really hard for killer to 4K, and even like with the best killers other than maybe nurse and stuff at that point, 4 barbecue stacks to get your double blood points. That was pretty much any content creator you were watching at that point was like, if I get my 4 barbecue stacks, that's a win. If you're able to successfully catch and down and hook each of the 4 survivors in your match, that was considered a win. Like, not even just like oh, you didn't get like completely destroyed. Like, no, that was a legitimately hard thing to accomplish in a match at that point in time with a vast majority of the killers. And that has obviously changed drastically, where 4Ks are a thing that happens pretty regularly. But even just comparing that, it's like things are going to constantly change within Dead by Daylight. Obviously, we have another huge patch. We had the meta shift from last summer. You have Eruption having recently gotten nerfed. You have the various other perks with Dead Hard and Call of Brine and Overcharge. Like, there's going to be another drastic shift, and we'll have to see how everything plays out. It's probably not going to shift the balance in one way or another too drastically, but it'll depend. And obviously there's map changes to some of the auto haven things. Like, everything is constantly changing within Dead by Daylight. So I think to just look at it from like a numbers perspective and have this like win on paper of like, this is what it has to be for me to achieve a win no matter what, and not accounting for how many variables are in the game, is like a really naive way of perceiving your own skill and your own potential impact that you have on a match, whichever side that you're on. And that's not even getting into with Survivor. If you're solo queue, you have a lot less of a chance, and there's a lot more RNG there with who your teammates are. I think that's like the powerful thing about a Swift, is that the teammates, if you're in a 4-man, are a constant, right? Like, you have control over who your teammates are and what the average strength of your Survivor team is. Solo queue, it could be absolutely anything, and that's going to influence a match heavily as well.
Yeah. One thing, you were talking about the barbecue stacks, and that was absolutely, when I was getting into Dead by Daylight, that was what I heard all the time. I got 4 stacks of barbecue, or on the survivor side, less so the we're gonna live forever. At the time, you gained a stack for safe unhooks, but really on the killer side, the 4 stacks of barbecue was entirely how people define wins. And I kind of want to dive into that a little bit here, because the change to barbecue, where they removed those blood point uh, incentives for doing that, for hooking the individual survivors each time, I think was a real shift in not only how killers and, to a lesser extent, survivors considered wins within their matches, but it also led, I think it was a driving catalyst to the mentality of tunneling and camping becoming more prevalent, which is a different issue, and one that we're going to talk about in a later episode, and maybe how the game can kind of tweak some perks or items and whatnot to kind of reward more of that old barbecue and chili playstyle of hooking each survivor individually, something like Grim Embrace, Subtle and I have talked about individually, and ideas of maybe changing other perks to behave based off of the number of unique survivors hooked, as opposed to just generic good perks or uh, things that don't disincentivize the kind of playstyles that behavior has said that they want to disincentivize. Again, that's a different issue, but I do think that that barbecue change really was a driving force into this, and did take away a lot of the kind of agreed upon viewpoints of what a win would really be considered in Dead by Daylight.
Yeah, and I think like there was definitely a long period of the community kind of having like an honor code. Like people joke all the time about a survivor rule book or a killer rule book of like what is acceptable to do. Otherwise, you're considered toxic, but it's not really toxicity, but maybe abusing the game mechanics might be a better way to frame it. But you have, talking about like the play style and that the shift in mentality, right? Like the barbecue change kind of coincided with their ranking system rework, because they were like, well, we're giving you more points this way, so we don't feel as much of a need to provide you extra blood points with the perk. And it's kind of like all centered around like this, that MMR being like a really contentious topic, which kind of, but I think the MMR, right, like once the community kind of understood how they worked on MMR and how it was largely driven by kills versus escapes, that really changed how a lot of players kind of viewed what a win was, because they felt like we had more defined system of ranking the players compared to what I think it used to be, which was with the emblem system or past versions of getting pips and going through the ranks and stuff like that. There was several iterations, but having a complete game where you were able to get a lot of hooks while also still getting kills and getting quick chases and using your power well, like that was what allows you to pip. And versus as a survivor doing a bit of everything, being someone who's able to do a maybe gen and a half worth of progress while also getting an unhook or two and healing and also giving a decent chase, and then also either staying in the match long enough for that you get at least like the silver emblem now, or successfully escaping and getting gold or iridescent depending on whether you were downed or not. So it's like being the complete package and being like a full team player and showing that you are good at all of the different aspects that can lead to survivors escaping is what was used to be reflected in the only rank that existed, and that changed, and now it's just a system that rewards you with points that don't really have much of an impact on the match or anything like that. So it feels like people stopped caring about that as much and then look at just the kills and escapes because of the shift from the old ranking system being what mattered to this MMR.
Yeah, and with the removal of the blood points that you were talking about, and that coinciding with the changes to like the MMR system, it also coincided with their role incentive, where if there are too many killers, they would award up to 100% extra blood points for playing as survivor, and vice versa. And so it was another way of them saying, hey, we're giving you more blood points for this, so we're going to take it away from that. But I really do think that that was kind of a. Uh, not only was it not fun for the players, I do think that it was kind of harmful for the mentality of the player base. Uh, One other way that we hear a lot in our lobbies of what people consider a win or not is, oh, you escaped, but I got more blood points than you as the killer. Or, using the blood points as a marker for how well or poorly you do in a match. And to that, my argument is the same one that we talked about before, where, you know, if I run the killer for 5 gens, or more reasonably, if you run the killer for 5 gens, and then you get face camped by a Bubba, you're really gonna max out at 10,000 points for boldness. Whereas, assuming that you don't get unhooked and you don't make it out and whatnot. Whereas I could just hold a few gens and like do a totem and leave and never interact with the killer, never do anything skillful other than hit a few skill checks, and I would score more points than you. That has no indication whatsoever of me being more skillful than you, and especially if you cross it over between the different roles, like it's very well known that killers earn more blood points in an average match than a survivor does. And I just don't think that there's any argument really to be made there for blood points being a direct correlation to how well a person plays or if they won the match. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I mean, like, even going with the blood points further, right, between the different roles, you also have like different killers are much better at farming a bit more blood points, right? Like, I think the notorious one is Legion because he's, or that, whether
And
you're just,
Doctor.
yeah, and Doctor, right? You're getting points for using your power, even if it's not like directly correlating to downs, which is what I think most people would indicate as like, oh, you won the chase. But you have just getting hits in Feral Frenzy or hitting a bunch of shocks or using your Static Blast to hit a bunch of survivors at once. That's not really like, that doesn't mean that you're getting the downs, which is how you snowball into hooks and how you snowball into confirming kills as killer. But both of them can easily get a lot of blood points despite not getting any kills, just because of how their powers kind of lend themselves. And if you contrast that to killers who get insta downs, you're not getting as many chases, right? So killers like Myers really struggle with getting down, with getting as many blood points, because they're often losing a lot of chases, so they're leaving chases and not getting the hits and stuff because they're just focused on stalking. And then when they actually get in chase, they're not having to win 2 chases, they're just having to win 1. You don't get double blood points because you took 2 health saves with 1 hit. The game doesn't reward you like that. So as far as blood points is concerned. So yeah, centering it around blood points also isn't really a good thing. Like, it really is more, I think, to me at least, and I think you mostly agree with that. It's more about the gameplay and the interactions between the players, that it requires some perspective of kind of analyzing how a match went rather than just looking at the results screen. It's not going to tell you nearly enough about what the game was.
Right, yeah. And you know, similarly along the same line, talking about how it's based off of the gameplay, looking at playing both roles, I feel like this is a little bit of going over what we did before, but it was an idea that popped into my head. So as a survivor, you know, I base my definition of winning or losing off of how those interactions go, whether they be, in chase or, unhooking and healing my teammates and whatnot, getting saves, whatever. Uh, but like if we're in an in-game situation where, we're not up against a Bubba, we're not up against a Hillbilly, we're not up against Eerie Head Huntress, that kind of stuff. Uh, you know, I'm generally gonna go for a save even if I die. Like I said, I don't base my win or loss condition over whether I escape or not. But I want to have those extra interactions even if they're during the end game, even if I can just escape. On the killer side, I really, for the first like year and a half, 2 years, I wasn't able to play killer at all. And so I only played survivor. So when I play killer, I play the type of killer that I would want to play against as survivor. So in a similar situation where maybe the right play, if I'm just going for, kills, is to camp a hook or to tunnel off hook. But I will always go and seek out further engagements with survivors because I enjoy the chase. That's why I like playing the game is for the chase. And that's just another metric that I don't think that the the kind of general consensus of what the community has agreed on, maybe a win, is actually what should be considered a win.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of anyone who's played Survivor, even if your role is more killer sided, if you're playing Survivor and you get to an end game, right, the killer's really struggling. They might have 2 hooks or something like that, but they hook someone in the end game. Doesn't even have to be Noah. It doesn't have to be a Bubba or something that where it's really hard to unhook. But you go in and you decide instead of leaving, let's try and create a 4-out situation, even though you could easily 3 people, like you have the gate, the killer is not trying to pressure anyone else and is just sitting at the hook. You could easily 3-out, but if the survivors decide to try to make a play just for their own entertainment and it doesn't work out and potentially leads to a worse circumstance, does that mean they lost the match, right? Like there's plenty of times I'm sure that that's happened to anyone who's played a decent amount of Survivor where you've gone for it, and if it doesn't go well, you get to the end game chat and their killer, there's plenty of times where you will go against the killer and they'll be like, GG easy, I won the match, or like you lost or something like that. But realistically, like the game already ended. The game was over and we decided to do something that didn't really like relate to how the match went.
And again, in that situation where you're going into the map again to try and potentially get a 4-out, you're getting more interactions with the killer. The killer's getting more interactions with the survivor. And if it goes poorly for the survivors, then what may have been a miserable game for the killer may suddenly become more enjoyable because in their mind, oh, I got more hits, or I got more hooks, or I got more kills. Whatever their serotonin receptors are saying in their brain made them have more fun. And irrespective of whether they actually get more kills or not, in my mind, if they had that, more fun experience, I consider that to be a win for them too.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think it's more interesting for both sides, and like those situations can be pretty chaotic with people trying to kind of, congregate around the hook and body block to avoid getting pulled off, or trying to avoid a trade situation where maybe they'll hit the person, someone else goes for an unhook, and that person runs away, and then the killer has to decide, do I just book it for the person who I hit off of the unhook, or do I try to tunnel the person who just got unhooked and wait out the unhook endurance? Like there's a lot of factors and a lot of survivors around, and trying to aim your hits, and depending on the killer, if you can, killers that can snowball really well, particularly like Huntress obviously, or Trickster, or any of the chainsaw killers and stuff, like there's a whole other dynamic there. I think that it leads to some really interesting situations, and not to mention that, like, at least for the survivors, right, they're opting to try to make a more risky play, with the idea being, let's see what we can pull off, and then you can kind of reassess after. Like, people are playing the game, and people enjoy, for the most part, I think, improving at the game with whatever they kind of value, and try to put their time and effort into improving at that aspect or multiple aspects. So if you're interested in seeing what you can pull off with a group effort around the unhook, whether you're in a Swift or not, then you should go for it, and not determine your success of the match whether or not it results in more or less kills. The game was, like I said, like if there's 3 people on Exegate and 1 person on the hook, the game was already over there, and now it's kind of just like a scrimmage almost, of just like, let's kind of go and see what happens for both sides and just test and experiment. And I think people, if you take away from, if you take a step back and don't worry as much about the result, I think you have more enjoyment. And like, as corny as it might sound, like that is more of a win, I think, is like finding enjoyment in the match and finding interactions and seeking out those interesting points in games.
Yeah, the last point that I would like to make on this topic is that I understand that people play the games for different, or play the game for different reasons. Um, and I'm certainly not trying to make it sound, and I'm sure you're not either, not trying to make it sound like our views of what a win or a loss is gospel and that everybody should apply it. But I do think that if you base your victory or loss condition on anything resembling like kills or escaping, or um, hook states, or however you try to quantify it, I think people are putting too much emphasis on that. I think that Having goals, people who do their win streaks, like that can be very entertaining. It can be fun for a lot of people, but when it causes you as a player to be stressed and not enjoy the game, when it causes um, you to lash out and be toxic to other people, and again, this applies to either role. It is not. It's completely irrespective of that. Um, that's when I think that it becomes problematic. I think that having an outlook of wanting meaningful interactions, being based off of how you feel you could have played throughout the match, how fun the match was for you or for your survive with friends homies or for everybody in the match as a whole. I think that that's a healthier way to look at what a win and a loss is, because it's based off of people enjoying it. And it doesn't matter whether it's a competitive game or a party game or somewhere in the middle. Like, the whole point of games is to be able to enjoy them and have fun with them. And it does sound kind of corny, but I do honestly, genuinely, 100% believe that that is the most important thing to have in mind when you're trying to evaluate a win or a loss in this game.
Yeah, and just like a really last point, just to tack on to what you said, is basically like I think either is okay, right? If you value going for your win streaks in the way that a lot of content creators kind of traditionally define them, then that's okay. But I think viewing other people, like if you're interacting and right, the two play styles are kind of clashing in an individual match, like it is legitimately possible for both people to win in a game that doesn't have any sort of defined win condition. And if you're a player that feels like you don't have, like, you should take more of an ownership over what you define as a win rather than only like taking from other people's definitions. Like, it's okay, like it can be a spectrum across the community of where you kind of fall on the more like traditionally competitive side versus like I'm only playing for the highlight reel moments and not caring about results whatsoever. I would say that I fall more in the middle. Like I enjoy like macro play and the micro situations as well, and like the efficiency versus like the really cool flashier moments. But it's okay to be anywhere on that spectrum, and I think more people will find more continued enjoyment if they kind of determine for themselves like where they fall.
No, well said. I
So
agree. Well, with that, we're gonna call that whole conversation to a close. We're gonna move on to a segment that we started last week, where we will each go over a build. So, Subtle, you're gonna be talking about a killer build. Do you want to go into that?
sure, yeah. I figured if I'm gonna start with the first killer build, the place to start is for Huntress. So for a while I've been running Lethal Pursuer, Iron Maiden, Darkness Revealed, and Deadlock has been my four perks. And I've kind of fluctuated a little bit with add-ons. I used to be really strictly using one of the two haft add-ons. There's a brown and a yellow, the bandaged and the oak haft, that reduce the amount of cooldown that you have at the end of a hatchet throw. So it allows you to start another hatchet throw or an M1 or any sort of other interaction a lot sooner. As well as the add-ons that give you additional hatchets. So there's the leather loop. This is a yellow add-on that gives you one, or the infantry belt, which is a purple and gives you two additional for a total of seven. But I have branched out more over the past several months of trying to get away from those and see what other add-ons work. And I've been using a lot of the begrimed head. There's kind of two of those add-ons. This is the purple one that essentially acts like Sloppy Butcher for her hatchets. So it applies both mangled and hemorrhage to the survivor when you hit them until they're full healed. And I've also been running the Venomous Concoction, which is the exhaustion one that applies 5 seconds of exhaustion when you're hit by a hatchet. But and I'll kind of talk about it a little bit, but I have been kind of thinking ahead to what the upcoming mid chapter might do to how I play with add-ons. But that's pretty much the build that I roll with.
So, in your build, you have Lethal Pursuer. In the past, have you tried Corrupt Intervention? Like, how do you kind of weigh Corrupt Intervention versus Lethal for your starting kind of get the ball rolling perk.
Yeah, so I used to run Corrupt pretty regularly, especially in its old form where it had the consistent duration of always lasting for 2 minutes. Huntress, despite her range, doesn't have the greatest mobility. Her power doesn't let her traverse the map faster. Plus, she's only a 4.4, like a 110% movement killer. So having kind of shrinking the map at the beginning is really beneficial to let her have more time to find chases. Whereas I think with lethal, I kind of opt more for that since she is a really strong anti-loop killer, so you can get downs really fast. And I feel like it kind of just negates the perk with corrupt if you get that down really fast. So I'd rather just use the lethal, get into that chase really quickly, and start my chain of events that way of just getting a hook, starting pressure, and then trying to find more survivors and just get a lot of hits as fast as possible.
So really, that started when they changed corrupt intervention.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So do you want to go over some of the synergies within the build? You know, whether it's the perks interacting with itself or the add-ons.
Yeah, so Darkness Revealed, right, is the perk that allows you to read auras of survivors who are near other lockers whenever you check a locker. When you combine that with Iron Maiden, which lets her check a locker faster and reload faster, right? She's a killer who spends a lot of time going in lockers anyway, so both of those make that interaction less punishing by making the duration shorter, but also giving you a tangible benefit every time you're forced to go there and reload. It even allows you the flexibility if it doesn't feel as detrimental to maybe reload a little bit early, even if you have a few hatchets left over and you're not completely empty. So it doesn't feel like it hurts as much to be able to go to a locker. And then also Lethal Pursuer, extending the duration of Darkness Revealed is really nice and gives her some time to kind of catch up and maybe corner a survivor in a portion of the map.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
So, you know, there's not really a shortage of slowdown perks. Recently, we've had changes to, some nerfs, some buffs to pain resonance, to eruption, to, pop goes the weasel. We've had a lot of changes. Where where have you like gone for your journey to end up at deadlock? Why did you choose that one, and what pros and cons kind of out, or how did you balance the pros and cons to settle on deadlock as opposed to some of the other slowdown available?
yeah, so like I said, I used to run Corrupt, but obviously that's not going to give you the like consistent 2 minutes. Whereas really Deadlock with the total time over a match, it effectively blocks gens for a total of 2 minutes, with each of the four gens popping before the last one. So that gives you, it feels like it gives me the same amount of slowdown over the course of a match, but it always gives it to me rather than the current version of Corrupt being way more dependent on whether I'm getting a down, which is like when I was trying to stick with Corrupt through the change, I was trying to change my playstyle of not getting it down as fast, of just trying to injure a bunch of different survivors as quick as possible. But that forces you to like leave chases or give up hits that you might otherwise get just to try to preserve a perk. So I've tried to look at like Pain Resonance is okay. I think that's probably what I would go with if I wasn't using Deadlock, but she's such a slow killer. It really hurts to try to stop and kick gens. You don't want to give survivors additional like distance, so I try to not stop and kick gens and use those perks.
Gotcha. Uh, Earlier, when you were going over the build, you were talking about some of the add-ons, and you also mentioned that you were playing around with some new ideas based off of the upcoming mid-chapter release. Do you want to go into why you started with the haft and the infantry belt, and then you switched to the begrimed head, and your path along these add-ons, and maybe tell us where you're looking after this mid-chapter patch?
Yeah, so I think it kind of felt with like medkits that it really would not feel as beneficial if I'm spreading around pressure. But the mangled and hemorrhage and being able to interrupt heals feels a lot better. Like I notice a huge difference when I'm running that add-on. I do wonder if with the change to the medkits, if maybe I don't see quite as much of a benefit. And I'm also considering the glowing concoction and chains for the exhaustion because I'm not really sure how much I'm going to see dead hard, which is mainly why I was using it to counter that.
Gotcha. Yeah, the only counterpoint I can really think of to that is, specifically in regard to medkits, is we are going to have those longer heals for medkits. So the mangled add-on will take it from 24 seconds to 32, I think. So you would get the extra benefit from that, but I mean, getting the aura reveal, you're already running Lethal Pursuer, so you do get extra benefit from that as well. So I think that's really smart.
Yeah, and I think like it's kind of going to be a situation of like I wait and see how the survivor player base reacts. Like if they opt to not use medkits, then I don't think that the begrimed head is nearly as useful. But if they're still going to be running them because they feel like that's something that they're just used to having the ability to self heal, especially with Circle of Healing not allowing you the ability to self heal anymore, that might be what people are only comfortable with doing. So if but if people shift to something like Inner Healing, right, like having Iron Maiden allows me to counter that perk already, so it's even more of a recent, like there's a lot of reasons I can see me moving away from that and going back to something else. But with the Glowing Concoction, I think gives you a lot of consistency, especially on some of the like corn maps are really good, where you have like no line of sight but the hatchets can still go through anyway. Swamp is like another one that's kind of similar. Any of the indoor maps, so that way you don't like lose track when they get their speed boost. But yeah, it's kind of going to be one of those things where I have to see how the survivors kind of react first to the patch and then I'll kind of play around with those options and see what fits best.
I think it's really interesting that on multiple occasions you've chosen more consistent options. So, with lethal as opposed to corrupt, you talked about you get the consistency of lethal every time. Uh, corrupt is inconsistent in that if you get the down early, you don't get the full value from the perk. Talking about deadlock, you consistently get the gens blocked for 2 full minutes every match, assuming it goes the distance. So really, your build is just focused on consistency, and then allowing you to kind of utilize all of the skill that you've attained from all of your thousands of hours playing Huntress to get all of your shots. And something like Darkness Revealed or the Glowing Concoction can really help you uh, get those pinpoint shots that you really need to kind of have your individual player skill take over in conjunction with the consistency that you get from the build itself.
Yeah, and I think that the build also lends itself to just kind of working organically over the course of a match. It's not, the perks aren't something that you have to go out of your way to use. So there's like, like gen kick perks, it's like you have to make sure you're kicking gens, otherwise they don't do anything. Whereas like all of these kind of work passively, especially the locker perks already work with Huntress's toolkit. Like that combo doesn't work the same way on most of the other killers, right? Trickster is another one that I think might lend itself to that combo, but for the most part, you'd have to, if you ran that on another killer, you'd have to go out of your way to open lockers, which just doesn't really gel with those powers. Whereas Huntress, it's like you're just sort of playing the character, and I don't have to worry about like, I don't have to worry about this perk having this amount of time or being on cooldown, and now I have to make sure I use it to make sure I get the most amount of uses per match or something like that, right? Like Scourge hooks are another example where you have to make sure that you're going for specific hooks, and maybe that means you're only taking chases in areas where you know your Scourge hooks are, so that way you can reach them. So these perks just kind of let you do what you were going to do anyway, and they just kind of supplement what you were already trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, last week when I talked about my demo build, I run Pain Resonance on it, and what you just described, where you really want to take chases in the areas that you know your Scourge hooks are, absolutely. I will absolutely give up, a few gens on Suffocation Pit on the opposite side of the map if all of my Scourge hooks are on track side. You can do all of the gens you want over on main buildings, so long as I can hold down the side that has all of my pain res hooks, because then it forces them to draw over and it gives me the value from it. So yeah, you do have to change your playstyle. You have to kind of, it is a more uh, active thing that you have to watch out for, as opposed to getting the passive value out of your perks. That I like that. That's good.
Yeah, yeah, and Huntress is like a killer that has like really polarizing strength in terms of tiles, right? Like there's some tiles that she just low filler loops she just kind of destroys, whereas a lot of the like main building loops that have really tall walls and maybe multiple stories where she can't use hatchets, she really struggles. So you sometimes always can't commit to going for chases, but slow down perks like pain res, like pop goes the weasel, like eruption, things that require you to get the down might lead you to feel like you have to commit to a chase to get value, whereas this lets you kind of just make your decisions that you were going to and being like, hey, this is not a chase worth taking, let me go spread around pressure. And that's where I think the begrimed head lets you play more of a hit and run.
Well, yeah, and you're as a huntress, you don't have any kind of built-in slowdown, so you're always having to be active. There's never a time where survivors have to remove a bear trap or disarm a trap or solve a box or something like that. So you're always being active on the map. You have to be active on the map, and so getting that kind of passive value from your perks, I do think is really important.
Yeah, for sure. But and I know that you wanted to kind of transition into swapping roles this week where you're doing a survivor build. So if you want to talk about the build that you wanted to spotlight, what you've been running a lot lately.
Yeah, so on Survivor, I've been running this build a lot for quite a while. It's kind of my main go-to build now. So it is Adrenaline, Deliverance, Vigil, and then your choice of exhaustion perks. Some work better than others, but it's really flexible. You can kind of do what you want with it.
And like, how do you kind of determine what you choose as that exhaustion perk to kind of round out the build? How do you kind of factor that decision making?
So one thing that I'll say is this build does benefit a lot more from being in a survive with friends. It's far from required, um, but it is beneficial for that. So if you're going to be running this kind of a build, uh, if you or any of your teammates are the type to bring map offerings, absolutely you can tailor your exhaustion build to or your exhaustion perk to that map. So for Midwich or Haddonfield or Eerie of Crows, you can run Balanced Landing, my personal favorite. If you're running the game, uh, you know, if you're running uh, Leary's, you can run Live. Sprint Burst is always universally good, no matter where. Dead Hard until the change happens, is pretty universal. We'll see how it is after the change. Um, Overcome is an interesting case that I don't think that this build is right for Overcome, but it's similar to Dead Hard and Sprint Burst, where there's not necessarily a particular map for it. And then there's background player, which is it's completely map independent. But the last one is Smash Hit, which I don't think is an actual perk.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. And I think,
And I guess head on,
yeah, sure.
head on is not right for this build at all.
Yeah, and I think that what you were saying with overcome makes sense with like deliverance, right? Where you're staying broken, it's like you have to make sure you heal back up to full to get the value. And like you
Exactly.
said, if you're not in a full team and you're in solo queue, you might have a lot harder time getting that full heal, so you can get overcome value.
Running Overcome in this slot is kind of the anti Dead Hard how it is now, where in order to utilize it at all, you have to be healthy, as opposed to Dead Hard, where you can take that initial hit at the hook. You may be able to get off a Dead Hard between the unhook and like when the killer can attack you again. Once you get off of the hook with the Deliverance, you have Dead Hard available to you. All of this stuff really does not work with Overcome. If you're trying to trade at a hook to proc your Deliverance, then you will get to the hook faster with your Overcome. When you get off of the hook, sucks to be you. You don't get a speed boost.
Yeah, and I guess talking about deliverance, right? Like, how do you decide whether you actually like use it on yourself, right? Because you have the downside of being broken. How do you determine whether you use it, when you use it, if you know you're definitely going to, especially in situations where you might be getting camped or something like that. Like, how do you weigh when you're going to deploy it, I guess?
Yeah, so this is really where there's two main interactions that I think are important or that you get extra value from of being in a survive with friends. And this is certainly one of them. So uh both activating like enabling your deliverance and then utilizing it is contextual to the how the flow of the game is going. As far as getting the person off hook to begin with to kind of activate your dead hard, um, you know, you can coordinate with your teammates and say, hey, I'm kind of close. I'm working on a gen. Let me finish it and then I can go. And I'll be dedicated to get that person off the hook, or go right now. I can go in as backup and we can kind of combo it. Uh, but there's plenty of times where I'll be across the map, or the killer will be pressuring multiple people, or heading to me, and me getting the unhook just isn't right. The more important thing I think is because there will be generally opportunities for me to get it procced in the first place, but getting yourself off of the hook, letting your teammates know, hey, I have this deliverance. You're freed up to take chases or set up your value boon or continue your generator or heal each other. I'm fine. The only time that I really don't advocate for using your deliverance, even if your team like knows that you have it, is if the killer's like on the opposite side of the map and you have a teammate that's nearby you and can unhook you. It just makes it so that you don't have to deal with that broken status.
Yeah, and I think especially with adrenaline, like in the end game, right? Like making sure that you get the heal state. It's like if they have the opportunity to do the unhook themselves, and you're not close enough maybe to a gate to just deliverance and run out, it's probably just better to let the teammate get the unhook instead of the self unhook.
Yeah, for sure. You would get so in the in-game scenario, like what you're talking about, you would not only get the 5-second adrenaline speed boost, but you would also then get the health state to be able to tank another hit.
Yeah, and Vigil, like what are the synergies and stuff that kind of work with that perk with the build?
Yeah, so I mean, Synergy puts in a lot of work into this build. Regardless of whichever exhaustion perk that you choose to run, you're going to be recovering in 40 seconds as opposed, or sorry, in less time. You're going to be accruing a lot of time of savings, and I think that especially if you're running Sprint Burst, Balance Landing, or Live, and arguably I would say sprint burst and then bounce landing. You're going to be able to proc those several times through the match because it's not dependent on your chase. If you're dealing with live, then you're having to make a loud sound notification, and maybe you don't want to alert the killer to your presence. Maybe they're like looking for somebody. You can use the HUD to kind of tell what the killer is doing. But in general, with sprint burst and with balance, as long as it's not old shelter woods, you have multiple chances throughout the match to proc that and then recover from the exhaustion very quickly. Similarly, your deliverance is gone in 40 seconds as opposed to 60. So you're recovering from the broken status that allows you to be able to, get a heal from a teammate, or heal yourself with a med kit, uh, to be able to get more value out of overcome if you brought it, or to have an extra health state to be able to take in the chase and just get back in the action. Take aggro for a teammate if you need to, and that taking up the aggro I think is really important with adrenaline. This is the second point that I think is really beneficial to be in a survive with friends for. We do it all the time. We'll say, 99 the last gen, adrenaline play, something like that, where I can go in for a protection hit to save a teammate from going down, or to take a protection hit when the killer is carrying the survivor to the hook that would kill them, or uh, you know, any number of different things where I need to help the team by taking some kind of aggro and then the teammate that's on the last generator can pop it and immediately get me that health state back and give me the speed boost. So there's actually a lot of different synergy here. There's also some um, lesser thought about synergies that don't come up very often, but one of the main ones is Haunted Ground. It's come up fairly frequently where a killer will have Haunted Ground, it'll pop, and I recover from the exposed status quicker than they're expecting. And there have been several times where I will get hit in that range where I have recovered from exhausted, or from exposed, where people who don't run vigil hadn't, and the killer expects me to go down, but I don't because it's already gone. It doesn't work with every source of exposed, so notably, like Ghostface stalking you does not get reduced by this. The exposed status from being in the Skull Merchant's drones does not reduce this, but there are plenty of situations where you do get extra benefit out of removing blindness to go and get your deliverance procced in the first place, or for the exposed, or several of these other status conditions. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned the med kits and stuff being something that pairs pretty well with deliverance and vigil, right? Because you want to get to that full heal as quick as possible after the self unhook, and the broken status effect going way faster kind of allows you to snowball straight into the med kit. Any other items or add-ons and stuff that kind of complement the build with med kits and stuff?
Yeah, so I generally will bounce between two items with this build, either a medkit or a flashlight. And it just kind of depends on how I'm feeling and what our team composition is looking like and stuff like that. So generally, I would say that the more consistent play is with a medkit. Currently, I'll run just a vanilla brown medkit. Sometimes I'll run a vanilla green medkit. Sometimes I'll run a souped out green medkit. It really just depends. Um, so you can gain that health state back to do all of the plays that I was talking about earlier. But similarly, a lot of times I'll run a flashlight. So if I'm going in to take aggro to, if I'm running sprint burst where I'm getting multiple sprint burst procs with my vigil, I can position myself better to get a flashlight save. Or, if I for some reason want to run background player, that will let me, you know, get in for the pallet save or the flashlight save when the killer picks up. Generally, I run balanced because it wouldn't be an episode of this podcast if I don't talk about balanced like a million times.
Yeah.
Um, but even from that, if there's a second story on main building or a hill, or there's several different places that I can proc balance, I can use that to traverse the map to go and get that flashlight save, or to take the chase over, and then blind at a pallet, or as the killer's vaulting, or to have some kind of interaction with the killer's powers until all of that goes away. But it's really those two items, either a medkit or a flashlight, I think pairs really nicely with this build.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think that that pretty much wraps it up. I think for the episode, I do enjoy doing the build spotlights. We mess around with a lot of different perks and different synergies and stuff. We like to experiment, so we'll probably keep regularly doing this as long as behavior's list of patch notes don't get too long. But
Yeah,
we'll
see how
see.
that goes.
Yeah, we'll see with the upcoming anniversary chapter in particular. There's I'm sure there will be a lot of stuff going on there. So
Yeah.
but
Well, in the meantime, thank you all for watching this newest episode of the Darkest Theory podcast. I am Scrap Brain. You can find me on Twitch and on Twitter at ScrapBrainSC2. And then we have Subtle, if you would like to.
sure, yeah, Z Subtle and everything. So Twitch, TikTok, Twitter. You can find me in all those places. And obviously we'll put all of our stuff in the description as well. So you can
Yeah.
find us there.
Thank you again for the graphic from Breadbun. Again, you can find them at breadbun__ on Twitter and on Twitch. And we will see you all next week for the next episode. Thank you so much.
Later, everybody.